The clerk's voice cut through the courthouse lobby with the hard edge of someone who had repeated the same sentence too many times in one morning. "Sir, you cannot stand here," she said, each word clipped, already tired of explaining the rules. She braced her hands on the counter that guarded the entrance to the family courtroom, her expression a practiced blend of impatience and authority. Behind her, heavy wooden doors waited, shutting out whatever fragile promises were about to be rearranged into legal endings. In front of her stood an old man. His name was Samuel Hart. His shoulders carried a gentle bend, the kind that comes from years of labor rather than weakness. His suit was simple and dark, the fabric thinned at the elbows but freshly pressed, as if he still believed that respect begins with how a man presents himself to the world. On his left hand rested a wedding band, worn down to a smooth circle of gold by more than 60 years of use. His eyes were clear, not confused, and they were fixed on the closed doors with a steady, quiet intensity. Around them, the lobby hummed with a low, exhausted tension. Younger couples sat on plastic chairs with manila folders balanced on their knees, eyes red from arguments that had gone on too long. Some leaned away from each other, bodies turned in opposite directions even though they sat side by side. A little boy swung his legs from a bench, humming softly to himself, too young to understand that the papers his parents carried were about to redraw his world. The clerk lifted a stack of forms and tapped them against the counter in a sharp little rhythm. "Family only," she repeated. "Parties to the case. If your name is not on the list, you cannot go in." Her gaze flicked down to the paper in her hand, then back to Samuel's face, already dismissing him. Samuel did not look at her. His eyes remained on the courtroom door. Somewhere beyond that wood, his grandson sat at a table with a stranger in a robe and a lawyer who probably called this a simple dissolution. On a sunny afternoon in a church many years before, that same grandson had stood shaking at an altar, swearing that nothing but death would separate him from the woman beside him. Now a few signatures would do what death had not been given the time to do. A security officer approached, shoes clicking sharply on the polished floor. He was young, his uniform neat, his expression carrying the impatient confidence of someone who had never needed permission to walk into a room. "Sir, you will need to step away from the entrance," he said. "This is a private proceeding. If you are not part of the case, you will have to wait downstairs or leave the building." Samuel glanced at the officer, then back at the door. There was no anger in his face, only a tired sort of sorrow, the kind that lives in a man who has watched the world drift far from the shore where he learned to stand. He wanted to say that he was family in a way no docket could capture, that he had stood as witness when this marriage began, that he had prayed over it, that his own vows were older than the building they were standing in. Instead, he simply placed his hand on the wall beside him, as if to steady himself against a wave that only he could feel. A young attorney nearby glanced over, took in the worn suit and the bent shoulders, and smirked softly to his client. To him, this was just another relic from another age, confused about how things worked now. Marriage to that man was likely some holy word. To the attorney, it was a case, a file, a billable hour. The officer stepped closer. "Sir, I need you to move away from the door, please. You cannot be here." Samuel held his gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back, not because he agreed, but because he understood that whatever was happening on the other side of that door did not have room for men like him any longer. Inside that room, vows were measured in legal terms: obligations, support, custody. The word sacred did not appear in the paperwork. As he turned and began to walk down the hallway, the clerk relaxed. The officer moved on. The attorney returned to his whispering. The small disturbance closed over like water after a stone has been dropped. Samuel walked slowly toward the end of the corridor, passing benches and tired faces, his hand brushing lightly along the wall. His grandson would walk out soon, papers in hand, marriage folded into a file. Samuel would be waiting, not to lecture, not to condemn, but to bear witness to something his grandson did not yet understand. This was not only his grandson's story. It was the story of the century that had taken marriage from sacred vows to silent distance, one small compromise at a time. Standing by the tall window at the end of the hallway, Samuel looked down at the city below and remembered a different time. Memory did not arrive in sudden flashes. It rolled in slowly, like morning fog, softening the hard lines of the present. He saw not the glass and steel below him, but the small town where he had been a boy, where marriage was the center of the map rather than just one option among many. His parents had married in a white-painted church with wooden pews and simple glass windows. There had been no intricate decorations, no carefully staged photographs, no rehearsed speeches. There had been a pastor who knew their names, a choir that sang off-key, and two families who understood that what was happening at that altar would shape more than the bride and groom. It would shape the children not yet born, the stories yet untold. His father worked long days at a factory on the edge of town, his clothes carrying home the smell of grease and iron. His mother stretched every dollar, cooked simple meals, and made sure the little house they lived in felt like a refuge rather than a burden. They argued sometimes, quietly, usually late at night when they thought the children were asleep. But in that world, arguments were storms that passed over a solid frame, not cracks that signaled it was time to abandon the house. The vows they had spoken were not poetic lines meant to impress the guests. They were plain words with heavy meanings. To love, to honor, to remain faithful, in sickness and in health, in want and in plenty, until death ended what nothing else was allowed to end. The community around them believed in those words. Churches repeated them. Laws recognized them. Neighbors expected them to be kept. When Samuel was a young man, he stood in that same church, heart hammering in his chest, watching the woman who would become his wife walk slowly down the aisle. Her dress had been sewn by an aunt. The flowers were from gardens, not shops. There was no talk of themes or trends. There was only family, a shared meal afterward, and older couples pressing his hand, telling him with quiet smiles to remember that love grows deeper when you decide to stay on the days when it would be easier to leave. Those early years of his marriage were not easy, though the memories now felt warm. Money was often tight. Work was steady, but never luxurious. Their first house was small, drafty in winter, too warm in summer. Children arrived with all the joy and exhaustion they bring. Yet beneath every hardship lay the solid understanding that they were in this together, and that leaving was not one of the options they kept on the table. The world outside their door helped hold that understanding in place. Divorce existed, but it was rare and carried a seriousness that made people think long before they spoke the word. The news of a marriage ending traveled through town slowly, like a sorrowful announcement. People did not celebrate it. They might understand it. They might even see it as necessary in some cases, but they did not treat it lightly. Samuel knew that in that older world, not every marriage was kind, and not every vow was honored. There were cruel husbands and wounded wives, secrets behind curtains and pain swallowed in silence. He never pretended the past was perfect, but he also knew that the basic frame had been stronger. The idea that two flawed people might promise to keep walking forward together, even when they did not feel in love, had not yet been mocked into extinction. He remembered evenings at his own table, his wife across from him, children chattering between them, plates mismatched, conversation shifting between school and bills, and the small events that make up a life. They had weathered times when they could barely speak to each other without frustration, times when grief or worry sat in the room with them like a third presence. But when one of them pulled away, the other waited. When one lost patience, the other tried to hold on to it. The vows they had made did not magically protect them. People do not stay together simply because they once stood in front of a pastor. But those promises acted like a compass when they felt lost. A simple, constant question: who did you say you would be on the day when everything felt beautiful and easy? And are you willing to be that person now when it does not? Looking down at the rushing traffic, Samuel felt the distance between that world and the one that had built the courthouse he now stood in. The older world had many flaws, but it had given couples a net of expectations, support, and gentle pressure that helped them stay when they might have drifted. The new world, he knew, had begun to cut those nets away. As the light shifted on the city streets below, Samuel thought about the long, slow drift that had taken place across his lifetime. A century had not broken marriage in a single dramatic blow. It had eroded it, grain by grain, until something once solid felt fragile in the hands of ordinary people. In the years after his own wedding, the country changed. Prosperity rose, then fell, then rose again. People moved from farms into suburbs, from small towns into cities. Work became less about survival and more about advancement. The culture that had once praised endurance began to praise self-expression. People were told to find themselves, to seek personal fulfillment, to chase a version of happiness that left little room for steady sacrifice. Laws changed too. It became easier to end a marriage than it had been for his parents. Courts no longer asked for a single serious cause. The phrase, "no fault," appeared, simple and clean, suggesting that sometimes a marriage simply stopped working and that no one in particular was to blame. On the surface, this made it easier to escape truly harmful situations. But it also sent a quieter message. If a promise became too heavy, one could simply set it down and walk away. Television and films began to tell different stories. Husbands were often portrayed as foolish or childish, wives as restless or perpetually unsatisfied. Affairs were framed as exciting, even understandable. Endings were written as moments of liberation, rather than as fractures that carried pain into the lives of children and extended families. The idea that love might mean staying when the feelings had cooled started to sound almost tragic. When Samuel's own children grew into adults and married, he felt the tension between his beliefs and theirs. They loved their spouses, but they were also quietly afraid of being trapped in something that might one day make them unhappy. They spoke about partnership, about equality, about communication, all of which were good and necessary. But he could hear, beneath their hopeful words, the influence of a world that said, if it hurts too much, you can always leave. Then came the flood of technology. Private messages slipped into pockets on glowing screens. Old flames could be found in seconds. Strangers could offer comfort from miles away. Images of other couples, other lives, other bodies appeared day after day, carefully polished and filtered, making ordinary marriages look shabby and dull by comparison. The quiet heroism of getting up each morning and choosing the same person again and again did not make for dramatic headlines or captivating posts. Samuel watched one marriage after another crumble, not always because of great betrayals, but often because of slow neglect and disappointed expectations. People began to believe that if a marriage was difficult, it was broken. That if they no longer felt the rush of early romance, something had gone wrong. The idea that love might be most authentic when carried through tiredness, illness, financial strain, and aging bodies grew foreign. Now his grandson sat behind that courtroom door, ending a union that had begun with all the same hope that Samuel had once seen in the mirror on his own wedding day. His grandson lived in a world that had told him to pursue happiness at any cost, to protect his own heart, even from the person he had sworn to share it with. Samuel did not see him as weak or immoral. He saw him as a man shaped by a time that had forgotten how to carry heavy promises. The century had not simply broken marriage. It had slowly changed what people believed love should feel like. It had taken vows that were once understood as anchors and recast them as options. And so, sacred words spoken with trembling voices in churches now ended in quiet signatures on courthouse forms. When the courtroom door finally opened, Samuel did not move from his place by the window. People passed him in small clusters, papers in hand, faces weary. Some looked relieved, some stunned, some empty. His grandson emerged among them, shoulders sagging under the weight of a folder and something heavier that he could not yet name. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The younger man hesitated, shame flickering across his face, then came to stand beside Samuel. For a while, neither spoke. They simply looked out at the city, where life flowed on without regard for any single broken vow. Samuel did not ask for details. He did not demand to know who was at fault. He had lived long enough to understand that blame rarely heals anything. Instead, he thought of the woman who would be walking out of the courthouse by another door, carrying her own version of this ending. Two people who had once stood before a pastor and whispered forever had now parted under fluorescent lights in front of a judge. In his mind, Samuel saw his own wife at their kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes tired but kind. They had stayed, not because it was always easy, not because they had never hurt each other, but because somewhere in their bones they believed that the vow mattered more than the moment. The years had carved deep lines in their faces, but those lines had become maps of everything they had survived together. He looked at his grandson and wished he could pour that understanding into him without words. That real love is less about never breaking and more about choosing to mend. That every marriage walks through seasons when the distance feels wide and the warmth feels faint. That devotion is not a feeling that appears on its own, but a decision made day after day, often when the heart is not sure it wants to. Later that evening, back in his small house, Samuel sat at his own table, with a worn photo album open in front of him. There was his wedding day. There the first tiny child in his wife's arms. There the restless teenagers around the dinner table. There the grandchildren, including the boy who had stood in a courtroom that morning and ended his first marriage. He touched the edge of one photograph and felt his ring press gently against the paper. The gold band was not shining anymore. It bore scratches and small dents, evidence of years spent fixing broken things, carrying groceries, holding hands through sickness and through grief. To anyone else, it would look unremarkable. To him, it was proof that vows, once spoken, can be lived. He knew that not every marriage should be preserved. He knew there were unions where violence and cruelty had twisted the promise beyond recognition. He knew that some endings were necessary, but he also knew this. The century had made it far too easy to walk away not only from pain, but from discomfort, from disappointment, from the slow work of growing up together. Outside, his porch light clicked on as the evening deepened. It cast a small circle of warm light on the steps where he had once sat with his wife on summer nights, listening to crickets and talking quietly about nothing and about everything. That light, faint as it was, pushed back a little of the darkness. Samuel closed the album and folded his hands. He could not change the laws. He could not undo the culture that had shaped his grandson. But he could live the rest of his days as a quiet contradiction to the belief that devotion is impossible. From sacred vows to silent distance, the story of marriage in his lifetime had been full of sorrow. Yet he believed the story was not finished. As long as there were even a few men and women who chose to keep their promises when no one was watching, who chose patience over pride and forgiveness over escape, the old meaning of marriage was not entirely lost. It lived in worn rings. It lived in old photographs. It lived in houses where porch lights still burned for the same two people year after year. And it lived, most of all, in the hearts of those who still believed that some words are meant to be carried all the way to the end.